Hi everyone, and welcome to the next video in the series on Nimzowicz's My System. This time we'll look at chapter 4, which deals with the passed pawn. Nimzowitsch opens the chapter by first defining what a passed pawn is, i.e. a pawn is passed if there is no enemy pawn in front of it on the same file, and also no enemy pawns on either of the neighboring files, meaning that it cannot be prevented from promoting by opposing pawns or by progressing. In this position, the white A and E pawns are passed, although the E pawn is blockaded, which is something that we'll return to later in the chapter. The black D pawn is also passed. So, due to their ability to promote, passed pawns are of course very strategically important. The fact that the E pawn is blockaded here does not run counter to the fact that it's passed. In fact, it's important to note that if one side is using a piece to prevent a pawn from advancing, then that piece is sacrificing a part of its own power simply to keep an eye on the passed pawn, and is thus restricted continuously. Remembering something from an earlier chapter, we should consider again here the fact that a pawn is a natural defender, and in that capacity alone superior to the other pieces in some respects. Nimzowitsch stresses that of all the pieces to blockade an ambitious enemy pawn, one of our own pawns is of course the best choice. Additionally, it is also the most secure defender, as it can't be chased away by opposing pawns, and will be difficult to attack if it is already blockading an opposing pawn. Also, it's the cheapest piece on the board, and as a result it involves the least amount of sacrifice if it's being used to prevent the advance of the enemy pawn, so its movement's not going to be too much of a big deal if it's restricted. So let's take another look at the diagram here. Neither of the B or G pawns are passed for white, although the B pawn is less restricted because the knight has an eye on G5, and the B pawn at least doesn't have a pawn directly in front of it. The G pawns, however, are opposing each other, and Nimzowitsch says that therefore they can be considered enemies. However, an opposing pawn on a neighboring file, such as the B and C pawns, are more like exactly that, neighbors. They can be a bit annoying. For example, when we're rushing out on an important errand, it sometimes happens that a neighbor appears and engages us in a long conversation about the weather or politics or the price of beer, and in so doing delays us considerably, just like the C pawn does here to the B pawn. Nimzowitsch stresses, however, that a talkative neighbor can hardly be considered a mortal enemy, and the same is true of the relationship between neighboring pawns. So now we'll look at the family of the passed pawn, i.e. the different factors that relate to it. The first thing to look at is the pawn majority, which is an important part of strategy. At the beginning of the game, all of the pawns are equally divided. They all have a pawn opposing them, or what Nimzowitsch referred to as an enemy, and all of those except the outside 4 pawns, the A and H pawns, have 2 neighbors. However, after the first pawn exchange, matters are changed. For example, let's consider the opening e4, e5, d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4. And if you now take away everything but the king and pawns, for the sake of clarity, the pawn majorities now become visible. White has 4-3 on the king side, and black has 4-3 on the queen side. Let's say that in order to prevent the advance of the e4 pawn, black plays d6, and as the game continues from here, black might at some point play f5 in order to attack the e4 pawn, after which the majorities on either side of the board will become much more pronounced. The rule that Nimzowitsch announces at this point of the book is every sound, uncompromised pawn majority is capable of producing a passed pawn. Now let's say that the game has moved forward to this position. White has won a pawn, but the focus of our attention is the pawn majority here on the king side with 3 against 2. Of these 3 pawns, which do you think should be moved first? Well, in fact, it's moved already. It should be like this, and the answer is the f pawn, of course, but we'll look at the reasons why that is. And the general rule in such positions is to move the pawn that does not have an enemy pawn opposing it. So this is the f pawn, obviously, because these guys are all facing each other. And the reason for this is because it's the least restricted and therefore has the greatest claim to becoming a passed pawn. Therefore, it's the rightful candidate, and consequently, it takes precedence over the other pawns. Nimzowitsch makes the humorous observation here that this rule is dictated not only by strategical necessity, but also by good manners, as the rightful candidate should be the one to go first and spearhead the advance, whilst the others support it. So correct would be f4, followed up with g4 and g5, and then f6 later to create the passed pawn. So after f4, g4, g5, and then f5, f6. And if instead the black pawns were on g6 and h5, like this, we would again start with f4, following up with g3, and then h3, g4, and f5. And there's no way for black to stifle our progress. For example, if we start instead of f4 with h3, black plays h4 and considerably slows down the progression. So now we'll have a look about blockading passed pawns. In this position, black has a passed pawn here on d4, and the thing about it, you know, the black is winning obviously here, but purely to demonstrate the idea that we'll be talking about, white can blockade the pawn with knight d4 or bishop d4, which results in the physical stopping of the passed pawn from advancing by a piece. The question again arises here as to whether the blockading piece is deprived of some of its activity by putting the blockade in place. Would it not simply be enough to keep an eye on the pawn and stop it from advancing? For example, at the moment, at least the bishop and the knight are both controlling d4, so if it advances, it's just going to be taken. And thus we're presented with the possibility that it's not a worthwhile exercise for the blockading piece to move in here to d4 before the pawn advances. And you know, an average commentator may say simply that the pawn must be stopped, but to Nimzowitsch this betrayed a poverty of thinking. He felt that the reasons why are very important if we're going to take studying chess seriously, and that we must immerse ourselves in the innermost being of the pieces involved. For Nimzowitsch, the passed pawn and all the other pieces had souls, just like humans, as well as desires that slumber unrecognized within them, and fears of which they are scarcely aware. And apart from that, the blockade has great practical use and ideas, which we'll look at in a moment. Nimzowitsch gave 3 reasons as to why a blockade is logically necessary. The first reason, in his words, is because the passed pawn is a criminal that belongs under lock and key. Gentler measures such as police surveillance are not enough. He expands on this by mentioning the passed pawn's lust to expand and the awakening of the men in the rear. Looking at this position again, it's clear that black's pieces are grouped around the d5 pawn, and they are harmonious complex, all supporting it, and have the pawn at its heart. And the rook is well placed to support the advance of the pawn. So the pawn's so-called lust to expand, i.e. advance, is so powerful here that black may even advance it immediately, allowing it to be taken in order to activate his pieces. The bishop on b7 would be firing down this long diagonal completely unopposed. The rook would have an open file to operate down if one of these pieces was to take on d4, and the knight would be able to move to the d5 square after the pawn is advanced, which is a very nice central square, stronger than f6. And the same idea of sacrificing a pawn in order to open lines or squares is also seen when advancing a pawn roll of several pawns down the board, and Nimzowitsch felt that this was sufficient proof of the lust to expand of passed pawns. He draws particular attention to the idea of advancing a passed pawn so that a knight can occupy the vacated square, and adds that although in this case 3 pieces come to life due to the advance of the pawn, it is often sufficient for only 1 piece to become activated. If it was white to move here, he would of course play knight d4 or bishop d4 in order to prevent the pawn from sacrificing itself and allowing the black pieces the activity they desire. Okay, that's the end of part 1.